Hello and welcome to the Beacon Salon Lecture Series. The Salon Lecture Series is an educational outreach program of Beacon College in Leesburg, Florida. Beacon is a nonprofit liberal arts school and America's first accredited baccalaureate institution dedicated to educating students who learn differently. In its third season, the Beacon Salon Lecture Series presents periodic lectures from September to April that feature Beacon College faculty addressing compelling subjects in their respective liberal arts fields. That trend continues with this installment as we explore one of the most inhumane periods in human history. Between 1933 and 1945, the German Nazi regime persecuted and murdered millions, including Romani people, the intellectually disabled, dissidents, and homosexuals, but particularly European Jews. As part of Adolf Hitler's final solution, mass killing centers were constructed in the concentration camps of occupied Poland, in which some 6 million Jews and approximately 5 million others were murdered, including more than 1 million children. Almost as horrific today is the truth-resistant strain of Holocaust denial that is infecting the world at epidemic proportions. In his lecture, Embracing Hate and Ignoring History, The Sordid Tale of Holocaust Denial, Dr. Christopher Huff addresses the fact that an unsettling number of Americans are questioning not only the basic facts of the Holocaust, but its very existence as a historical event. Knowledge of this critical event in history has dwindled slowly since the 1980s, when numerous efforts were undertaken to educate Americans about the Holocaust through new school programs, memorials, and museums. This process has been exploited by a fervent community of deniers who reject the accepted history of the Holocaust. Dr. Huff's presentation explores the origins of Holocaust denial, the deceptive strategies it employs, and discusses its place within the rising tide of American white nationalism. Dr. Christopher Huff is an assistant professor of history at Beacon College. He specializes in 20th century American political and social history, focusing primarily on the protest movements of the late 1960s, the civil rights movement, and Southern history. His essay, Conservative Student Activism at the University of Georgia, appeared in Rebellion in Black and White, Southern Student Activism in the 1960s, a panoramic view of Southern student activism in the 60s. Dr. Huff has published and speaks regularly about social and political activism in Atlanta and the state's colleges and universities. He has been quoted recently by the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the Washington Times, Associated Press, the Voice of America, the Christian Science Monitor, the Nashville Ledger, and was featured twice on the Trump podcast. His op-eds have appeared on floridapolitics.com. And now, the Beacon Salon Lecture Series is proud to present Dr. Christopher Huff.
Thank you, Daryl. The Holocaust happened. This should not be a controversial statement. It is one of the most well-known events of 20th century world history. It involved millions of victims and left behind tens of thousands of witnesses, as well as a wealth of documentary evidence. Today, still, there are survivors of the Nazi death camps who bear witness to the horror that occurred during the Second World War. If you're so inclined, it's possible to visit the sites where millions of Jews lost their lives in the cruelest ways imaginable, sites such as Majdanek, Bergen-Belsen, Treblinka, and Auschwitz. For those who cannot tour these sites, it's possible to visit one of the numerous museums and memorials located in the United States or Israel or across Europe. A visit to the United States Holocaust Museum and Memorial in Washington, D.C., or Yad Vashem in Israel, or even the Florida Holocaust Museum in nearby St. Petersburg will provide visitors with thorough and ample proof that, indeed, the Holocaust did happen. But for some, none of this matters. For some, the Holocaust, despite all this evidence, simply did not happen. How can this be? How can this mountain of evidence and witness testimony simply be ignored, refuted, and dismissed? In this lecture, we will explore how and why a cottage industry of Holocaust denial emerged in the decades since the end of World War II, and how in recent years it's gained strength and followers through the development of social media and the growing popularity of right-wing political extremism. To begin, we have to ask, what was the Holocaust? While most people have a basic understanding of what happened to the Jews of Europe through the actions of Nazi Germany, it is likely that this knowledge does not venture far beyond basic concepts such as the Nazis wanted to kill all the Jews, or that Jews were killed in gas chambers at a place called Auschwitz. While there is certainly factual truth in these statements, a more specific and detailed understanding of what we mean when we talk about the Holocaust is necessary in order to understand how Holocaust denial can seem convincing. In fact, it is the general public's lack of detailed knowledge that allows Holocaust denial to grow, flourish, and draw in thousands of curious people to their web of lies, obfuscation, and misinformation. So to fully understand how Holocaust denial works, we must know the answer to three key questions. 1, who was murdered by the Nazis? 2, why were they killed? And 3, how were they killed? So who were the victims of the Holocaust? Among scholars, there is not complete agreement on which groups should be considered victims of what we know as the Holocaust. For some, the Holocaust includes millions of non-Jews killed by the Nazis during World War II, groups such as the Roma and Sinti, groups more popularly known as gypsies, as well as Germans with mental and physical disabilities, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, and Soviet prisoners of war, among many other groups. But for others, though, the Holocaust describes what happened to European Jews specifically. So for the purposes of this discussion, the Holocaust will be centered and defined on what the Nazis did to the Jews of Europe, because this is the group that Holocaust deniers focus their efforts on. The answer to the second question, why did the Nazis murder millions of Jews, is at its root one based on intolerance, perceived difference, and political hatred. While anti-Semitism has existed in Europe for centuries, it morphed into a particularly virulent strain of prejudice in the hands of the Nazis. For Nazis, the Jews were a racially different group of people. Many people are familiar with the idea that the Nazis wished to create, quote, a master race, which by definition implies that there are other races. And for Nazis, most of these races were just not different, but inferior. In addition to being inferior, the Jews were also guilty of unleashing on the world the ideology of communism. As fascists, the Nazis abhorred communism. The fact that several Jews had played prominent roles in the 1917 communist revolution in the Soviet Union convinced the followers of National Socialism that the Jews were doubly guilty. That not only were they an inferior race, but they supported a political ideology that was seen as an enemy of everything that the Nazis believed in. This belief led the Nazis to begin removing Jews from prominent positions in German society very soon after coming to power. The program of mass murder that occurred in Eastern Europe during the war years, over a decade later, was, and what is commonly called, quote, the final solution to the Jewish question, was indeed that, the final solution to a problem the Nazis had been trying to solve since coming to power, namely the removal of Jews from European society. And finally, to answer the third question, how did the Nazis murder the Jews of Europe? The process of killing Jews evolved during the 12 years of Nazi rule. Prior to the outbreak of World War II, the Nazis did not kill Jews on a large scale or in a systematic way. While many Jews were placed in concentration camps, and many did die there, these camps were not intended to be used, and were not used, as sites of mass extermination, but rather as places to intern people perceived as socially deviant or as enemies of the state. It would take the outbreak of World War II for the Nazis to launch a series of actions that, in their design, focused on killing large numbers of Jews. While Jews from all corners of Europe died at the hands of the Nazis, most of the activity of the Holocaust occurred in Eastern Europe, since most of Europe's Jews resided in Eastern Europe. As we can see from this map, of the approximately 9.5 million Jews living in Europe when the Nazis came to power in 1933, around 6.8 million lived in Eastern Europe. In fact, one of the things that made it so easy for Nazis to target Jews when they came to power in Germany was that they made up such a small part of the German population. In 1933, Jews comprised less than 1% of the German population, roughly 500,000 out of a total population of 67 million. It would take the invasion of Eastern Europe starting in 1939 for the Nazis to encounter the bulk of Europe's Jewish population. But once there, the Nazis employed three primary means for murdering Jews. The first method was the process of ghettoization. Beginning soon after the invasion of Poland in 1939, Nazis created Jewish ghettos in towns and cities around the country. The Nazis forced Jews from other parts of the city and the surrounding countryside into the ghetto, often giving them less than a day's notice to move. The ghettos quickly became overcrowded, leading to starvation and outbreaks of disease. The Warsaw Ghetto, at its height, contained approximately 450,000 people in an area of less than 1.3 square miles. Between 1939 and 1942, when the remaining Jews in the ghetto were transported to the extermination camp at Treblinka, more than 80,000 died in the ghetto from a variety of causes. So as this map shows, the Nazis established ghettos throughout the entirety of the war across Eastern Europe. It became the first and perhaps most widespread way of controlling and eventually eliminating Jews from the countries they occupied. The Nazis embarked on a large-scale program of planned murder, though, soon after the invasion of the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941. Following closely behind the German army were the Einsatzgruppen. These were forces composed of military and paramilitary troops that were tasked with the elimination of Soviet citizens deemed to be enemies of the Nazi occupiers. And while the Einsatzgruppen targeted Soviet party officials early on in the invasion, they quickly shifted their focus and their efforts to killing the Jews of the Soviet Union. How did they do this? Well, upon coming into a new town or city, Einsatzgruppen troops would round up the Jewish population and transport them to a place outside of town, where the victims were often made to dig a large pit. Once that job was done, the victims would be systematically shot. Sometimes this process lasted hours and resulted in thousands, if not tens of thousands, of deaths. This process had become known as the, quote, Holocaust by bullets. The largest killing of this kind took place at Babi Yar, a ravine on the outskirts of the city of Kiev in Ukraine. Over 2 days in September 1941, Einsatzgruppen death squads murdered over 33,000 Jews. As deadly as this method was, shooting proved ineffective for the Nazis' larger goal. And over the fall and winter of 1941 and 1942, the decision was made to create dedicated extermination camps where Jews from across Europe could be transported and quickly killed in gas chambers. By the summer of 1942, in what became known as Operation Reinhard, the Nazis were operating 3 dedicated extermination camps in Poland, one at Belzec, one at Sobibor, and one at Treblinka. These camps were shut down by the end of 1943, but not before using carbon monoxide from diesel engines to kill approximately 1.7 million European Jews. Following the end of Operation Reinhard, the Nazis centered their killing efforts at Auschwitz II, also known as Auschwitz-Birkenau, which had been in operation since 1941 as a combination forced labor and extermination camp. Using the pesticide Zyklon B, the Nazis killed approximately 1.1 million Jews in 5 crematoria at Auschwitz. So taking all of this into account, we can see that the Nazis used a variety of methods and locations from 1939 to 1945 in their effort to exterminate the European Jewish population. By the end of the war, roughly 380,000 Polish Jews remained alive out of a pre-war population of 3.3 million. Other European nations also saw a large percentage of their Jewish populations murdered by the Nazis in a variety of ways. So why is it important to know these details? Why isn't it enough to simply say that the Nazis hated the Jews and killed 6 million of them? Because it's exactly the lack of detailed understanding and knowledge that Holocaust deniers exploit to their advantage. Okay? As with so many other issues, information truly gives you power. Knowing the details of the Holocaust allows us to more effectively refute Holocaust denial claims. The origins of Holocaust denial can be traced back to the actions that Nazi Germany took to cover up its actions during the war. By 1944, the Nazis had completely destroyed the 3 primary extermination camps used during Operation Reinhard and attempted to disguise the site as farmland. In addition, during its retreat from the Soviet Union, the Einsatzgruppen would disinter the victims of the Holocaust by bullets and cremate the remains. As the Red Army approached Auschwitz, camp records were destroyed, the crematoria were blown up in an attempt to hide their function, and remaining prisoners were forced to march into Germany. These efforts proved, ultimately, unsuccessful for the most part, although they did contribute to early estimations of the number of Holocaust victims being much higher than now accepted, a fact that Holocaust deniers often use to discredit what occurred. For example, initial estimates included several million Jews killed in the gas chambers at Auschwitz, a number that is now widely accepted to be around 1.1 million. So in the first decade and a half after the end of the war, Holocaust denialism slowly emerged in Europe, particularly France, and in the United States, although its presence remained on the far fringes of the political spectrum and it had few advocates. But for the first generation of deniers, men such as Paul Razanier in France and Harry Elmer Barnes and Austin J. App in the United States, Holocaust denial served as a function of their more blatantly expressed anti-Semitism. According to historian Deborah Lipstadt, quote, "The first group sought to vindicate the Nazis by justifying their anti-Semitism. While they argued that the atrocities were exaggerated or even falsified, they also contended that whatever was done to the Jews had been deserved because the Jews were Germany's enemy," unquote. Over several publications published in the late 1940s to the early 60s, Razanier laid out several arguments that laid the foundation for the future of Holocaust denialism. There are 5 primary that he laid out. 1, atrocities were committed against the Jews, but they were greatly exaggerated in number. 2, the atrocities that occurred in the camps were largely committed by fellow inmates, not the Germans. 3rd, the camps did not have gas chambers. Number 4, he rejected the 6 million figure in regard to the number of Jews murdered. And finally, the testimony of Holocaust survivors cannot be believed. Raznier's final contribution was the creation of an explanation for what he called the, quote, genocide myth. If the Jews had not been the victims of genocide committed by the Nazis, how and why had the myth of genocide been created? His answer was that it was created as part of a conspiracy involving the Allies and the Jews to force Germany into paying billions in reparations, funds that would play an important role in the founding of Israel. These claims were picked up by Harry Elmer Barnes in the late 1950s, who was a U.S. historian and who spread them through a variety of publications and lectures. Austin J. App, an English professor at the University of Scranton and LaSalle College, furthered the cause of denialism through the creation of what Lipstadt labels as 8 fundamental tenets of Holocaust denial. These tenets expand upon Raznier's claims and act as the central arguments for contemporary Holocaust denial. All current Holocaust denial concepts originate out of these 8 fundamental tenets. So first, immigration, not extermination, was the Nazi plan for dealing with Germany's Jewish problem. His main evidence for this assertion is that if Germany had planned total extermination, no Jews would have survived. The second tenet, no Jews were gassed in any German camps, and they probably were not gassed at Auschwitz either. He argued that the crematoria were designed to cremate those who had died from other causes, natural illnesses or diseases such as typhus. Third, Jews who disappeared during the years of World War II and have not been accounted for did so in territories under Soviet rather than German control, making it more difficult to locate them once the Cold War began. The majority of Jews who were killed by the Nazis were people whom the Nazis had every right to execute as subversive spies and criminals. The fifth tenet is that if the Holocaust claims had any truth, Israel would have opened its archives to historians. Instead, he claimed, they have preferred to continue perpetuating the Holocaust, quote, hoax by utilizing the charge of anti-Semitism against anyone who questioned it. The sixth tenet says that all evidence to support the Holocaust hoax of 6 million dead rests upon misquotes of Nazis and Nazi documents. Then there is the burden of proof argument. It is incumbent upon the accusers to prove the 6 million figure. Instead, App argues, Germany has been forced to prove that the 6 million is correct or incorrect. This argument rests upon App's and others' assertions that reparations paid to Israel by Germany are based on the 6 million figure. He consistently refers to reparations as a Zionist swindle, inflating the numbers in order to get more money out of Germany. And then finally, the eighth tenet is that Jewish historians and other scholars have great discrepancies in their calculations of the numbers of victims. App takes this as evidence that the claims are unverified. It is important to note, though, that numerous historians have repeatedly and successfully refuted and disproven all of these tenets. There is no truth to these 8 claims. So, while these early works laid out the foundational arguments that future Holocaust deniers relied on and would expand on in their own writings, they do not represent an organized movement focused on debunking the Holocaust as a singular historical event free from the stain of anti-Semitism. Rather, books by people such as Barnes and App and Gerald K. Smith and others challenge the facts of the Holocaust as part of a larger, easily identifiable campaign of anti-Semitism that aimed in part to justify the anti-Jewish policies of the Nazis and undermine the creation of the Jewish state of Israel. The Holocaust, in other words, was a Jewish conspiracy theory that they aimed to debunk as a way of showing that Jews were evil. But by the 1970s, however, the Holocaust denial community changed. It began to shift and change in goals and composition for a variety of reasons. The first is that it was invigorated by a growing interest in the history of the Holocaust in American society. As more people began to become interested in understanding the Holocaust, deniers became more interested in refuting it. Another reason is that the growth in the number of extremist right-wing groups happened during this period, and they had an increasingly diverse set of goals and beliefs, many of which worked very well with the claims of Holocaust denial. And then finally, there was the creation of a, quote, professional organization that served as an outlet for new theories and ideas about Holocaust denial. So, to take these one at a time. A renewed interest in the Holocaust developed in the 1970s, and this was expressed in a variety of ways. Colleges and universities, for example, began offering courses on the Holocaust. In 1978, Pope John Paul II was elected, and this brought attention to events in Poland because Pope John Paul II was Polish, and he had existed there, or lived there, during the Nazi occupation. The broadcast of Holocaust, a 4-part television miniseries, also played an important role in creating interest to what happened to the Jews of Europe. Over 120 million Americans watched the series, as did 20 million Germans when it was broadcast on television there. A little more than 6 months later, in late 1978, President Jimmy Carter established a presidential commission on the Holocaust that eventually recommended the creation of a United States Holocaust Museum and Memorial, which today resides just off the National Mall in Washington, D.C. At the same time that interest in understanding the Holocaust was on the rise, also on the rise were the number of racist, white nationalist, and anti-government groups in the United States. These groups, in varying ways and for a variety of reasons, embraced anti-Semitism and trafficked in the same conspiracy theories about Jewish attempts at world domination that had been used by earlier anti-Semites, such as Henry Ford, for example. Traditional groups such as the KKK, Ku Klux Klan, which had in the past been wary of aligning itself with neo-Nazis, became more receptive to them as it recognized and repurposed itself in the 1970s. In addition, former Klan members founded new racist organizations such as the White Aryan Resistance and the National Association for the Advancement of White People. The latter organization was founded by David Duke, who had embraced neo-Nazism as a young man and been a Klan leader before embarking on a career in mainstream politics by getting elected to the Louisiana state legislature as a Republican. The Pacific Northwest became a hotbed for white nationalist and anti-government organizations. Groups such as the Posse Comitatus, the Aryan Nations, the Order, and others had compounds in the region, which became meeting places for individuals and groups that embraced a wide variety of conspiracy theories, including anti-Semitic ones, making them receptive to the claims of Holocaust denial. And then finally, Holocaust denial, quote, scholarship emerged to enter the academic, or attempted to enter the academic mainstream through the creation of the Institute of Historical Review, or the IHR for short. The IHR had its root in the Liberty Lobby, an extremist right-wing group founded by a man named Willis Carto. While involved in various white supremacist and anti-Semitic organizations, it was the IHR and its publishing arm, Noontide Press, that existed as Carto's most important contributions to the evolution of Holocaust denial. According to Deborah Lipstadt again, the IHR aimed, quote, to move denial from the lunatic fringe of racial and anti-Semitic extremism to the realm of academic respectability. The most public aspect of the IHR was its main publication, the Journal of Historical Review, a publication designed to mimic mainstream, respectable academic journals, but which in reality existed as a means to spread incorrect and discredited theories about Jews and the Holocaust. Its first issue appeared in 1980 and included articles by well-known Holocaust deniers such as Austin App, Arthur R. Butts, and Robert Farazan. These individuals, along with others who rejected the term, quote, Holocaust denier, and instead preferred to be called, quote, revisionists, used the JHR to spread various denial theories. In addition, many would be featured speakers at the organization's annual conferences. And while the contributions to the JHR considered themselves serious researchers, few others did. According to Brian Levin, quote, most were regarded in academic and other circles as being a discredited cadre that manipulated history, generally for extremist political causes. With a few scant exceptions, the IHR's publications and conferences under scholarly veneer present an assortment of individuals whose objectivity and historical expertise are suspect. The extremist groups of this period, along with the Journal of Historical Review, played a significant role in spreading the message and the ideas of Holocaust denial from the 1970s through the 1990s. And for a variety of reasons, however, many of these organizations are no longer active, either through internal conflicts, legal troubles, or confrontations with law enforcement. The formal activities of these organizations have diminished over time. However, the rise of the internet would play an even more important role in perpetuating the lies of Holocaust denial than these organizations ever did. The attempt to create an academic veneer for Holocaust denial reached its peak in the late 80s and early 90s through the activities of the Institute of Historical Review and the publications of the Leuchter Report, a thoroughly discredited effort to show scientifically that no gas chambers existed at Auschwitz. Also, following the Irving versus Lipstadt trial in 1996, in which David Irving failed in his effort to sue Emory University professor Deborah Lipstadt for libel after she labeled him a Holocaust denier in one of her books, the effort at organized Holocaust denial significantly dwindled. However, the rise of the internet in the 90s marked the beginning of a new and more troublesome phase in the history of Holocaust denial. Holocaust deniers could now reach a much larger audience than ever before. And conversely, it became much easier for anyone with a passing interest in the Holocaust and an internet connection to find themselves fully immersed in Holocaust denial websites with just a few clicks of a mouse. In the early days of taking Holocaust denial online, efforts were made to basically digitize the writings of well-known deniers, such as Arthur Butts and David Irving. Other websites acted as collecting points for a variety of denial documents, basically taking what had been published in print and moving it to the internet. William Allington had noted that these websites began as little more than online archives and resource centers. For example, the Journal of Historical Review began publishing its archives online in the late 1990s. The internet also made it possible for Holocaust denial to easily reach across international borders, as websites dedicated to denial that originated in the United States, France, Belgium, Germany, amongst other nations, could be accessed by people easily around the globe. But perhaps most importantly, the internet has significantly increased the numbers and activity of casual Holocaust deniers, as opposed to organized or professional Holocaust deniers, those who have committed themselves to the creation of Holocaust denial material and who run denial organizations and websites. Holocaust deniers, casual Holocaust deniers, are seemingly less committed to arguing for the validity of denier arguments, but rather they act as the foot soldiers in spreading those arguments. They are the ones who spread videos and links regarding Holocaust denial. As William Allington defines this phenomenon, quote, casual Holocaust denial encompasses not only Holocaust denial advocates who use it as part of agendas such as anti-Israeli extremism, but also the laymen of the organized movement, who are largely anonymous redistributors of the material created by the movement's central figures. They keep organized Holocaust deniers in business by providing website clicks, giving donations, and subscribing to the publications, while keeping their ordinary day jobs and keeping their identities secret. Casual Holocaust deniers are essential to the spread of Holocaust denial on the internet because they take the material from the organized Holocaust deniers and spread it on message boards and via emails and social media so the movement can grow. The spread of Holocaust denial on the internet has only increased with each passing year. As early as 2009, Facebook groups organized around Holocaust denial existed, and hashtags such as hashtag HoloHoax became popular on Twitter. Discussions about Holocaust denial can be found on sites like Reddit, and videos questioning the facts of the Holocaust can easily be found on YouTube. So what are the current challenges that people who wish to combat Holocaust denial face? Well, there are currently 4 challenges facing those who fight against the spread of Holocaust denial. First, Americans have become increasingly less knowledgeable about the Holocaust than they had been several decades ago. The second challenge is the internet's role, an increasingly more important role in spreading Holocaust denial. A third challenge is the resurgence of right-wing extremism and, more importantly, its connection to mainstream politics and political figures. And then finally, there is the more general growing popularity of conspiracy theories. The first challenge is to continue the process of educating the American public about the Holocaust. This is now more important than at any time in the last several decades. Several recent surveys have found that Americans have very limited knowledge of the Holocaust, and more disturbingly, have started embracing some components of Holocaust denial. A national survey of U.S. millennials and Gen Z conducted in 2020 found that almost 50% could not name a single concentration camp, and more than 60% did not know that 6 million Jews were killed. Many believe it to be around 2 million. In addition, 11% believed that the Jews themselves caused the Holocaust. And more than 50% have seen Holocaust denial materials on the internet and social media. These results roughly concur with those of another survey of adults of all ages in the United States, which found that 40% could not identify Auschwitz, and that about 1/3 thought that 2 million or fewer Jews were murdered in the Holocaust. The second challenge is to identify and remove as much Holocaust material from the internet and social media as possible. There have been some promising changes on this front. In October of 2020, Facebook announced a change in its policy regarding Holocaust denial content. They began reclassifying it from, quote, misinformation to hate speech, a decision that would trigger its removal from the site. And more broadly, more well-known sites such as Twitch and YouTube and TikTok have specific Holocaust denier policies. Others, such as Twitter and Discord and Reddit, have more general hate content policies, although they do not have any policy specific to Holocaust denial. But while these policies do exist, they do not always result in effective self-policing or to the removal of reported content from the site. Third challenge facing those who wish to combat Holocaust denial is the resurgence of right-wing extremist groups, the presence of anti-Semitism within these groups, and the connections these groups have with mainstream politics. The most famous or infamous example of this phenomena is the events that occurred in Charlottesville in 2017 at the Unite the Right rally. Prominent white nationalist figures such as Richard Spencer, David Duke, and Christopher Cantwell were present, as were members from extremist groups such as the KKK, the Traditional Workers' Party, Vanguard America, Identity Europa, and the Proud Boys. Right-wing demonstrators at Charlottesville quoted, quote, "Jews will not replace us." They wore Hitler t-shirts, while one banner there read, quote, "Jews are Satan's children." While demonstrations like the one in Charlottesville are justly described as extremist, often the people who organize, lead, or participate in them have gained access to the corridors of legitimate political power. They have found support among national politicians, and in some cases have even won election to office themselves. In the wake of the Unite the Right rally, President Trump stated there were, quote, "very fine people on both sides in Charlottesville." During a presidential debate in 2020, he refused to openly condemn white supremacism, but instead signaled his support for the extremist group, the Proud Boys. Other Republican politicians have developed relationships with anti-Semites and Holocaust deniers. In 2017, Florida Congressman Matt Gaetz invited Charles C. Johnson to the State of the Union address. A known Holocaust denier, Johnson had stated that, quote, "I do not and never have believed the 6 million figure. I think the Red Cross numbers of 250,000 dead in the camps from typhus are more realistic." And in the most recent and most bizarre incident, a 2018 social media post written by the newly elected Congresswoman from Georgia, Marjorie Taylor Greene, blamed California wildfires on a, quote, "space laser controlled by Jews." The fourth and final challenge to fighting Holocaust denial, and one closely related to the previous points, is the proliferation and popularity of conspiracy theories in the United States. Holocaust denial is, at its core, an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory built on the delusion that there has been a global Jewish conspiracy in existence for centuries, which aims to grab control of global politics and finance. This theory has proven remarkably resilient and flexible, leading to its inclusion in a number of more recently created conspiracy theories. For example, it worked its way into theories about the cause of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. It worked its way into concerns over something known as the New World Order. And most recently, it's worked its way into QAnon, which, while not being overtly anti-Semitic, relies on global conspiracy tropes that have their roots in anti-Semitism. In fact, a 2020 survey conducted by the Washington Post found a close correlation between QAnon, Christian nationalism, and anti-Semitism. Belief in these theories leads its supporters towards not only more overt and virulent anti-Semitism, but specifically Holocaust denial theories. So, what can we take from this? The history of Holocaust denial reveals the lengths that anti-Semites will go to further their agenda. As has been discussed, Holocaust denial is not an effort to, quote, revise the historical record or gain a more refined understanding of what happened to European Jews during the Second World War. It is instead, today, as it has always been, a particularly insidious form of anti-Semitism that attempts to use the appearance of academic inquiry and the belief in free speech to spread misinformation about the past and hatred towards Jews. Thank you very much. Darryl, back over to you.
Dr. Huff, thank you for that provocative, truth-honoring, insightful, and thoughtful presentation. Would you like to follow up with questions or your own observations for Dr. Christopher Huff? Feel free to send your questions or comments to beaconsalon@beaconcollege.edu. And that concludes this installment of the Beacon Salon Lecture Series. Join us next time for the next installment of the Beacon Salon Lecture Series featuring Michelle Zitlakowski, exploring pachyderms and people, the complex situation surrounding animal tourism in Nepal. Visit the Beacon College website at beaconcollege.edu/salon for the latest up-to-date listing on when the program will premiere. Until then, I'm Daryl Owens. Thank you for joining us.